reminded of that occasionally, and just kind of occasionally put that umbrella over everything that we're studying. You know, I'll repeat my philosophy about our understanding of the Bible is like a clothesline that goes from that wall to that wall. And many of our clotheslines, we got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, a little bit of 1st and 2nd Kings, but then our clothesline dropped to the ground. And then it picked up in the New Testament. And we have our line here, but we had this big gap in here of the prophets and the history during that period of time. And the thing that was missing, and the reason that we had that gap, at least I'll speak for myself, is because I never knew anything about the history of Assyria, Babylonia, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And you can just read the Bible text and keep up with everything until you get to Kings. But then at that point, you have to bring in some world history in order to understand the prophets and the relationship that Israel had to the nations round about them and what happened to them. And the prophets really won't make, most of them won't make very much sense to us until we understand a little bit about that history. When we get there, we're going to spend some time talking about Assyria and Babylonia, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Because that provides a backdrop for the prophets and all the things that are associated with that time period. And so I thought I'd just take a few minutes and talk about again that overarching story. We began in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 12, God gave Abraham 3 promises that provide a 3-point outline of the Bible. God promised Abram that he was going to make of his descendants a great nation, that he was going to give them the land, and through his descendants, through his, quote, seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. And so that's a 3-point outline of the whole Bible. And we have talked about the fact that that first promise, he's going to make them a great nation, involves Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and we get down to Moses, we get to Exodus chapter 1, and all the things associated with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all those things are involved in God fulfilling that first promise, that he's going to make them a great nation of people. We get to Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, and it talks about here now we have these people in captivity in Egypt, and now they came over in Joseph's time. Things are really, it was a relief for them to get there. Right? They were fleeing from starvation, basically. And then they became a great nation of people while they were there. It said the land was filled with them. They multiplied, became, King James Version says, became exceeding mighty. And the land was filled with them. And so that's the fulfillment of the first promise. And that nation that is formed of Abraham's descendants is called what? What's their name? Jews, Israelites, Hebrews, children of Israel. Those are all synonymous terms that denote that nation. Now we are embarking, from Exodus chapter 1, we're embarking on the fulfillment of the second promise. And that second promise is God's going to give those people a land. And so we start out with them coming out of Egypt, right? In Exodus, then Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We go through the book of Joshua when we get to the end of the book of Joshua. And all the things that took place and transpired during that interval, and that would be the Exodus, their time at Sinai, the sending the spies into the land, the wandering for 40 years, and then finally coming back being ready to cross for given a second chance to go into the promised land. And that's where we just ended with the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And what is the major event that marks the end of the book of Deuteronomy?
Moses'
chunk of the Old Testament just involved the incidences that happened in Moses' life. And now we get to the book of Joshua, and Joshua is going to take Moses' place, and what's going to be his primary function? Conquering the land, right? And so we get to the end of the book of Joshua, the 21st chapter, verse 43 through 45, and it says, God gave unto them all the land that he swore to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. There fell not aught of anything that God promised, but all came to pass. So they got the land, right? So now, from that point on, there's only one promise that God made to Abraham that remains to be fulfilled. And that is, through your seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, the Jews misunderstood that. And they thought that when that promise meant that through them as a nation, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed. But when we get to the New Testament, that's cleared up, isn't it? Whenever God told Abram, through your seed, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed, who or what was the fulfillment of that? Jesus Christ, right? Galatians chapter 3. It said when God said to Abram, through your seed, he did not say seeds, plural, meaning many people, but unto thy seed, which is Christ. So, that is an overarching umbrella picture of the whole Bible. We come back to the end of Joshua, and we pick up, what's the next book after Joshua? Judges. What's the problem that's presented in the early part of Judges? Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. There was no overarching government there. And so everybody lived in his own house, under his own fig tree, eating his own grapes and so forth, and everybody did what they wanted to. And so during that period of time, the people that have been driven out, God's going to allow them to come back and repossess some portions of that land. And when they do that, they're going to enslave, essentially, those people who inhabit that area. And so when we go through Judges, you're going to have that cycle of sin, servitude, sorrow, and salvation. And we'll talk about that more when we get there. But it's a cycle that repeats itself over and over and over through the book of Judges. And God will, he'll send these people in to punish the people who left him and gone away and served foreign gods and intermarried with the nations round about them. And they will oppress God's people, and after a period of time, they'll cry out to God for help, and God will respond to them, and he'll send a deliverer. And that deliverer will be in the form of an individual that will be called a judge. And the judge will primarily be a military leader. But we'll have that cycle, let's repeat, over and over and over again, and we'll see what nations it was that came back and inhabited at least portions of the promised land. And then after Judges, you have a little book called Ruth, and Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 says, during the period of the Judges, you're going to get a little insight into what life was like during that time period through the eyes of one family or one woman, as it were. And so, and then you come to 1st and 2nd Samuel. Tell me who Samuel was. How does Samuel fit in this overall picture? Samuel is the last judge. He's the last judge. During his lifetime, he will anoint 2 kings. And those 2 kings are who? Saul and David. Right? He will die during David's lifetime. And now we begin, and by the anointing of the kings, and whenever the people came to God and they said, we want a leader, a king like the nations round about us. And God relented, and he gave them that king with certain warning associated with it, which by the way they chose to ignore. Yes, sir?
They had a great judge.
Pardon?
They had the best judge.
They did.
Yeah. Where did the Persian Empire fall in?
Saul and all the things associated that we know about his life and his pursuit of David and so forth. And then David and Goliath incident happens and catches the attention of Saul. And then God tells Saul he's rejected and there's going to be a better man than him put in his place. And so he comes to recognize that David is that better man. And so he pursues him to try to kill him. And you remember all the story associated with his son Jonathan and the friendship between David and Jonathan. And so now, this period of time, we go through the period of Judges. Now we're into the period of the Kings. And the period of the Kings is going to last for quite some time in our study here in the context of the Bible. And so we're going to have two divisions of the period of the Kings. What are they? United Kingdom and divided kingdom. United Kingdom is going to be when all 12 tribes are under one king. How many kings will reign during that period of time? Saul, David, and Solomon, right? Solomon, after Solomon, his son's name is what? Rehoboam. And Rehoboam chooses a bad choice. He goes to his peers for some advice. As a result, the kingdom is divided. And the two divisions are going to be what?
Northern Kingdom.
Israel and Judah. Judah, the capital city of the tribe, two basic tribes of Judah, southern tribes, is what? Jerusalem. The capital city of the 10 northern tribes is going to be what? Samaria. So you're going to have Judea in the south, Samaria in the north. And Samaria is both a city and a region. Okay? So that sometimes is confusing. Now, after a certain number of years, and I'll hand you out a chart, after a certain number of years, Israel, the 10 northern tribes, they will never have a good king. They'll have 13 kings. They'll never have a good king that follows God. Judah will have a few. But once the split takes place, Israel will never have a king that follows God. And so after a given period of time, God sends a nation in to carry the 10 northern tribes away captive. Who is it? What's that nation? Assyria. There's a difference between Syria and Assyria. That's two different places. Syria is the northern neighbor of Israel. Assyria is a completely different country over here in between the Tigris and Euphrates in the north up there. So Assyria is going to come and they're going to conquer the 10 northern tribes and carry them away captive. And they're going to take them and they're going to kill many, many of them. And then they're going to take the others away and deport them to different places. How long will Israel remain in captivity? Forever. They're gone. 135 years later, and by the way, Assyria tries to capture Judah, but God doesn't let it happen. There's going to be a really interesting story involved in that. But after 135 years, and the prophets, now you start throwing the prophets into this, you'll have prophets initially, and the little chart that I gave you that hopefully you have in front of your Bible comes into play right now. There are prophets who prophesied to both Israel and Judah as long as they were existent. Once Israel was gone, then the prophets are going to be prophesying to Judah. And basically what they're going to be saying is, do not follow the footsteps of your sister Israel. But they're not going to heed it. And they're going to do just as bad and worse. And so 135 years later, Assyria has now fallen to what world empire? Babylonian. So the Babylonians, and God sends them, gonna pay him. And so he comes with his army, and they capture Judah and Jerusalem. They carry them away captive. There will be 3 times that Nebuchadnezzar will come back. He has to come back because there will be a king in Judah that will rebel and decide he's not going to pay the taxes. So Nebuchadnezzar will come back, and he'll take more people away captive. They'll rebel again, and he comes the 3rd time. And when he comes this 3rd time, he says, okay, I'm tired of messing with these Jews. There ain't going to be nothing to come back to. And so he burns the city, and everything is destroyed. He takes away all the people except, the Bible says, the very poorest sort of the people are left. And they're going to have a really hard life because the crop that they try to raise and stuff, raiders are going to come in, and they're going to have lots of problems. But they become, that group that's left will become the Samaritans. And the Samaritans will be, if you will, half-breeds. They will be Jews who intermarried with the people that Babylonia did very much like Assyria. They deported people. And the deportation policy was really, really effective. Explain to me, just real briefly, why would a conquering nation want to take people and deport them to other places? Any ideas?
So it won't be another Egypt.
So that's right, because if this, assume that took place here, and let's just say that 80% of the people that lived in Monroe, Louisiana, were taken to some foreign country. Some of them were taken to China, some of them were taken to Africa, some of them were taken to the Far East or Middle East, wherever, and they were put anywhere within that Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire, Babylonian Empire was really, really big. It took everything that Assyria had and added to it. And so now they bring people from those other places they've conquered, and they put them in the homes of the people that they deported from Monroe, Louisiana. So you've got a neighbor on each side. One of them is from Africa, and he speaks Afrikaan. And then you have another one from China, and they speak Chinese. Then how long is it going to be before you're able to organize any kind of rebellion? It ain't going to happen in your lifetime. And it's probably not going to happen in your children's lifetime. It's going to take at least 3 generations before you begin. You don't want your kids associated with their kids. They don't worship the same God, they don't speak the same language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But kids being kids, they're going to learn how to play together a little bit, aren't they? And whenever they grow up, some of them might be married to one of these Chinese kids, and so forth, and so forth. Then you get this eclectic society, and everybody begins to speak the same language, whatever that might be, you can communicate. But it's going to be very effective for a long time. And so that's the reason for the deportation policy. And so they carry, the Babylonians carry Judah away captive. And as I said, they came 3 times. And you're really going to get deep into the prophets right here, because Ezekiel and Daniel were very much involved in the deportation. One of them was going to be taken captive and taken to Babylonia. The other one's going to remain in Judah, but going to have communications back and forth and so forth. But anyway, we'll get into all that. And so, how long is Judah carried away, and how long do they remain in captivity?
70 years.
70 years. And then after 70 years, you will have, just like you had 3 deportations, you will have 3 returns. And those returns are going to be, that story is going to be told where? Ezra and Nehemiah. Now Esther is going to be kind of like Ruth. It's going to be a story that fits into that time period, all right? But when you have read from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, you have read the story of the Old Testament. That's where the Old Testament comes to an end. You will have 3 returns. The first one will be to restore the city walls, I believe, if I'm not. The second will be to restore the law, and the third one will be to rebuild the temple. And so the Old Testament will come to a close. And the scene will be that Jerusalem is in the process of being rebuilt. And it's gonna be pretty sad, but there will be a temple there. It won't be anything like Solomon's temple. And the Bible's gonna say that whenever they laid the foundation of it, then the people that were older that had seen Solomon's temple, they cried. And the young people that had never seen Solomon's temple, they rejoiced because they didn't know how grand a place Solomon's temple was. But that's the close of the Old Testament. And all of the prophets now are gonna lay back over that history that we just talked about. And that's where your little chart's gonna come in handy. That we'll go through and we'll see those kings and what's happening during those time periods that those kings reign. And it will start out like Ezekiel will start out there in the days of Hezekiah and so forth and so forth. This is where he prophesied. And we'll know, we'll have an understanding for the first time for many of us. We'll say, you know what? I enjoy reading the prophets now. Before then, it was just pure pain and drudgery to read through the prophets because we didn't know how to make it relate to anything. It didn't make sense. It sounded like the same thing over and over and over again. And it's depressing, by the way. You know, the prophets always end with a light at the end of the tunnel, but about 90% of their prophecy is going to be, this is why God's punishing you. This is what's going to happen to you. That's why this is happening to you. And so the Old Testament comes to an end. And there will be a time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's called the Intertestament period. And that will be a period of about 400 years. When the Old Testament closes, and I didn't bring this up, but to answer your question, Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians. And it is under the Medo-Persian Empire that the returns take place. Assyria and Babylonia have had deportation policies. They took people and they moved them to other places where they conquered. The Medes and the Persians, they were welcome as deliverers. Because what they did is they said, anybody who's been deported from your homeland, if you want to go back home, we'll help you go back home. And among those people that they conquered were the Jews, and that's what the Old Testament is concerned about, the history of the Jews. And so just like there were 3 deportations, there'll be 3 groups that go back under the Medes and the Persians. And that, when the Old Testament closes, you will have had the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and now, when it closes, we're in the middle of the Persian Empire. 400 years passes. The Bible is silent. It opens with the birth of John the Baptist, the New Testament, right? Now, who's in control?
Rome.
Rome is the world power. And so we go back 400 years earlier, the Medes and the Persians were the world power. Now, when the New Testament opens as Rome, there will have been a world empire that rose and fell during that 400-year period of time. And what empire was that?
Greeks.
The Greeks. And the Greeks had an incredible influence on world society. The Greeks were intellectuals. And in your college days, maybe some of you for high school, whenever you started studying trigonometry or some math or some science, usually the first thing that the teacher said was, this originated with, and they will give a Greek name, because the Greeks were really incredibly intelligent and well-educated, and they were good in the sciences, they were good in mathematics, and so they gave the world a lot. And it's really interesting to go back and see what each one of those civilizations contributed to the world. Assyria didn't contribute a lot, okay, but Babylonia began to contribute some, and as you progress, those world empires became more, quote, civilized, if you will. And it wasn't that they weren't cruel to their enemies, because they were pretty cruel to their enemies. But when the New Testament opens, Rome is in control. And you go back to Daniel, the prophet had a dream. this tall figure, and the head was of gold, and the chest was of silver, and then brass, and then iron, and the toes were iron mixed with clay. And that was during the days of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, is the backdrop for that. And Nebuchadnezzar had this dream that really bothered him, and Daniel interpreted that dream for him. And whenever Nebuchadnezzar had been dreaming, that dream repeatedly, but he didn't know what it meant. And so Daniel interpreted that dream for him, and he said, "Thou, O king, are the head of gold. And after you will become another empire that will be inferior to you." That would be after the Medo-Persians came, Greek. Then another one, you had Assyria's already gone, by the way, by the time you had this dream. So you had the Babylonians, Medo-Persians, Greek, and Rome. And when you get down, he said, in the days of this fourth kingdom, the God of heaven is going to set up his kingdom. And it will never fall. It will never be left to another people. Every other world empire has fallen and been left to another people. And he said, remember what it was, it's going to destroy that image. You remember what it was? It was a rock that was cut out of a mountain without hands, and it hit that image in his feet. And this would, he said, during the days of this final kingdom, this fourth empire, that would be Rome, God of heaven is going to set up his kingdom, and it'll never be destroyed. It'll never be left to other people. And that's what? The church. That is the kingdom that God set up in the days of the Roman Empire when Jesus came. Right? So that is an overview, and occasionally we just need to stop and get that overview, get that big picture again. And it's just one story, folks. Just one story. And when we get our part where our clothesline fell down was we didn't get that history. All right? And you don't have to know a tremendous amount about those world empires, but you got to know a little bit about them. All right? You got to know that they existed anyway, and that they provide the backdrop for the prophets. So, who has a question, criticism, observation, or comment you'd like to make?
I find it interesting that the people surrounding Jerusalem thought about trying to rebuild the city, like the Jews thought about the Gentiles in the New Testament.
Yeah.
They thought they could never do it.
Yeah, it really is interesting when they come back and rebuild the city walls. You're gonna have some really interesting stuff take place. And they come and they pour the slab, as it were. And they didn't pour a slab, that's just said they did. They made the foundation for the temple, and then they got problems, and so they quit. And they had already assembled a lot of material for the building of that new temple, and those materials got used somewhere else, over a period of time. And God's going to send a prophet. He's going to say, tell me what you think you're doing. You've built for yourself not only your sealed houses, but you've built summer houses for yourself, and my house is lying in waste. It's time for you to get off your backside and get busy building my house. And that's going to be, you're going to have one of the prophets, that's going to be his fundamental message. It's time to get busy building. It's going to be a couple of things.
Got my memory about Daniel. I know the king found favor in him because he interpreted the dream. But he made efforts to have that dream interpreted by his own people.
He did. That's right.
And then Daniel did.
Yeah, that's right.
Not only interpreted it, he knew, tell them what the dream was.
Yeah, that's right. That was the problem, because he said, he called all these wise people together, and he said, I'm having this dream. And it bothered him so much that he said, you're going to tell me what the dream is, and then you're going to interpret it. And they said, no king has ever asked anything like that. That's impossible. And so he said, well, look, I'll tell you what, if you don't do it, I'm going to give you a certain period of time. If you don't, I'm going to kill every one of you. And Daniel was going to be the ones killed. And so he asked for just a little time, but he went to God, and God revealed to him the interpretation of the dream.
Quite sure.
these stories are just incredible, wonderful stories. But they all fit into a one big story, one big picture. The Old Testament, the message of the Old Testament is somebody is coming. The New Testament says, hello, he's here. All right? And so all that period, and what I think many of you will find interesting, is when we get into some of the history of those world empires, and then in the intertestament period. Now, I warn you, I probably won't live long enough, but when I taught this at Woodland Knolls, where I came from, we spent over 2 years on the intertestament period. And it is fascinating, the story, the history that's in that intertestament period. All right? Anybody got a comment?
You're amazing.
No, no, the Lord is.
I just found out the Jews got out of Egypt, you know.
That story, you know, it's just, you can enjoy reading whenever you have this overall picture in your mind, because now your clothesline is hung all the way across, and every time you read something in the Bible, you can walk over here and there's a coat hanger. And you can walk over here and say, you know what, that goes right between this door and this door, and it goes right here.
See, I wish it was.
And you'll know.
that way, but I know what I did.
Yeah.
Because of books.
And that makes it so much more interesting when you know how things fit together and where this story fits in.
Easier reading.
When you're reading about the kings and chronicles and stuff though, it puts, this is happening in Israel, this is happening in Judah, and they keep going back and forth talking about when this king died, then this
That's
one
right.
arose in the year of this in the other kingdom. And it gets really confusing who's doing what, because it's constantly interspersing them. I wish it was kind of, at least somewhere, it was split up into this is what Israel's doing, this is what.
And that's where your little chart's gonna come in handy for you.
Okay.
Yeah, but it is, they Kings and Chronicles, and you have to understand what I'm saying, it's kind of like Matthew and Mark. They tell the story of the same time period, but they tell it from a different perspective. And we'll talk about what that different perspective is, the difference between Kings and Chronicles when we get there. But they do date each other by the other kingdom.
Right.
In the 3rd year of Hezekiah, so-and-so, the king of Judah, so-and-so began to reign in Israel. And so they will date the events that happened in one kingdom by the other kingdom.
Do you know of any accounts that actually separate, this is what happened when Israel had kings, and this is what happened, that, where they're not interspersed, so you can kind of tell them apart and see?
Your chart.
You got it, sir.
I'm telling you, that chart is one of the best things that I have ever given anybody. And you're gonna learn to appreciate it more and more when we go through all this that we just got through talking about. I mean, I have one in front of every Bible I've got, except for this is the little New Testament, because I refer to it every time when I'm back in the prophets. I flip over there and look, and instantly I know what's taking place. I can see. Just for instance, get your chart out. You got a chart? Let me just give you a little for instance.
You talking about this one?
Yeah.
He did it in class.
Okay, well, remind me, I'll give you one.
I don't have all of
But you don't have one? Okay, we're running way ahead, and this, I'll give you a better one than this, but here's one that you can look at till I get you one better. If you'll notice, I have 3, now by the way, I didn't write this chart. I do actually have one, that's a homemade one, that connects this into the intertestament period and the New Testament. And I made that lots and lots of years ago, and it covers a big span here, but anyway, and I just connected it just like this one was. But you'll notice up at the top left-hand corner, you should have 3 days. One of them is 732, Damascus falls, 612, Nineveh falls, 539, Babylon falls. You got those 3 days, right? And And if you'll look and find those on the chart, look at 7:22, yeah. Or you can look at 7:32. Notice some things. You see where it is up at the top right-hand corner on your chart? Notice some things about it. Okay, Israel is, if you'll look at the different, these two connect together. All right, you see the little rough edge on the right-hand side at the top, the rough edge at the bottom on the left hand? They connect together, but if you put them all together on one page, it'd be so small you couldn't possibly read it. But it's, this one chart goes like this, all right? When you come to the top part of that, you have two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. The bottom, you only have one. Why? Because Assyria has carried Israel away into captivity, and Judah is left alone, all right? But now notice what happens with the kings in Israel at the very, as you get close to the end of Israel's history. What do you notice about them? Man, they're just a bunch of them, right? And what's taking place is you're having lots of assassinations. The kingdom is in big trouble. And some of these people only last a matter of days, and they get assassinated. And so, man, these kings are falling. They're falling. And then Israel comes to an end. And now you have Judah alone. And notice the prophets. You have the kings and the prophets. Look at Isaiah and Micah, for instance. You see them? They're up at the top right-hand, not top right-hand corner, but on the right-hand side of the top one, at the bottom of it, Isaiah and Micah. You notice that they are prophesying, they're beginning their period of prophecy before Israel falls. Notice the cluster of prophets again drop down to 612 when Assyria falls and Babylonia takes over. You'll see a cluster of prophets just before Assyria falls and just as Babylonia is beginning. You can look at that chart and you can look at, say, Nahum, or you can look at Zephaniah. And before you ever open it up, you can almost know what they're going to be prophesying about. They're going to be prophesying that this kingdom is about to fall, and there's going to be another one coming. And that's what they're going to be prophesying about. And notice the cluster of them. And then you get to Babylonia. Look at Habakkuk. Habakkuk begins to prophesy just in the very early days of Babylonia. And so when you learn something about those kingdoms, you can know what, before you ever open it up and read a word, you can know what they're going to be prophesying about. And that's a general truth, okay? And then you've got Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and they all overlap for a period of time. And we'll know what the history is, what's taking place. Because Daniel is going to start out, how does his story start? He's a young man that's taken away captive by whom? Nebuchadnezzar. He's taken away into Babylon. And so he's going to be prophesying in Babylon. Ezekiel, on the other hand, is going to be staying in, no, Ezekiel is taken away also. But anyway, we'll get into all that. I won't tell you about that right now. And then you get to the end, and during the time of, after Babylonia has fallen, the Medes and the Persians have come, then you're going to have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi that are going to be prophesying. They're going to be prophesying as the curtain comes down and closes the Old Testament, and the people are returning. That's what the story is going to be about. And where do you go in your Bible to read the history part of this? Ezra and Nehemiah. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are going to be prophesying during the days of these kings that we just talked about, just at the end of it. And so this little chart is going to be a really, really valuable tool for you, all right? particularly when we get into the prophets. And, I think that you'll find it'll be something that you'll use for the rest of your life. It came from the Old Testament history by William Smith, that is a college press book. I don't know if it's still in print or not, but I think I left the page number on there that I copied it out of. But then I added all the color stuff to it. All right?
Question. I know that we don't have a record of the intertestament period, but do you think they had prophets and people still telling for,
I don't assume that they did not, okay? But we don't have, like you said, we don't have a record. We have a historical.
Right.
The closer you get to present day, the more history you have. We don't have a lot. You go back about Egypt, you know, when they, back there in the early days, when God sent Joseph and so forth. You don't have a lot of written history back in that time. But as you keep coming closer and closer and closer, and any of you that have ever been to London, to the museum there, you can see some artifacts from this very stuff that we're going to be studying when we get there. The Rosetta Stone, Ishtar Gates, they're all there. I mean, those things have been preserved, and you can stand there and look at them. This was exactly, not a replica, this was the real deal of things that happened in Assyria, in Babylonia, in Medo-Persia, there's been a lot of unhappiness about that the British in the British Museum, that they have all those artifacts from different places. And they say, well, you stole them from Iran, or you stole them from here. But if they hadn't done it, they wouldn't have been preserved.
So does it go up
Yeah.
and check this?
Anyway, I got a hush somewhere. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. God bless you. And remind me, and I'll get you a